Hello and welcome to my channel. Are you ready to drift off to sleep in peace? First, close your eyes and let yourself be carried away by the story. Please don't forget to subscribe to Manuel and leave a meme, a comment. Boy allem als akfanen, safaken sissy. Jusilerin, Carolyn, and Elk, and the castle sleeps. Or so it seems. Long before the first gray light touches the battlements, long before the lords and ladies stir beneath their heavy wool blankets and fur-lined coverlets, another world is already awake, ogging, moving quietly through stone corridors, feeding flames, carrying water, preparing the great machine of noble life so that, when morning truly comes, it will appear to have arranged itself. This is the world of the castle servant. And it begins in darkness. In a medieval castle of the 13th or 14th century. Whether standing in England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, or the kingdoms of Iberia, the household stout staff numbered anywhere from a few dozen to several hundred souls, depending on the wealth and rank of the lord. A great magnate might command a household rivaling a small town. Even a modest knight's fortified manor house required a staff of cooks, grooms, washerwomen, and general laborers simply to function. These people did not live outside the castle and arrive at dawn. They lived within its walls, in the lower halls, the service wings, the kitchens. The castle was not just a fortress or a residence. It was a community, and the servants were its beating heart. A servant's day in a large medieval castle typically began between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. There were no alarm clocks, of course. The rhythm was set by bells. Church bells from the chapel within the castle grounds or from a nearby parish. The canonical hours structured the day for clergy and laity alike. Matins, the night office, rang in the small hours. Lauds came before dawn. And between those bells, those whose duties demanded it rose from their pallets, their shared beds, their straw mattresses in the hall, and began. The first to rise were the fire makers, those charged with tending the hearths. In a great castle, fires were the lifeblood of warmth and cooking alike, and allowing them to go fully cold overnight created enormous practical problems. A skilled servant knew how to bank a fire before sleeping, to cover the glowing coals with ash so they would smolder through the night, and need only to be coaxed back to life with bellows and fresh fuel in the early hours. This was not a simple art. Banking a fire too tightly could smother it entirely. Too loosely, and the wood might burn away before morning. Experience was as everything. The fuel itself, wood, peat, or occasionally sea coal in coastal regions, had to be stored, carried, and distributed. This was exhausting physical labor. Great logs for the hall fireplace. Smaller faggots of bundled sticks for the kitchen ranges. Charcoal for the more controlled heat of the braziers used in private chambers. Each type of fuel had its purpose, and the servant responsible for fuel supply knew the castle's needs intimately. As the first fires were revived and new ones laid, the kitchen staff began to stir. The castle kitchen in a wealthy household was as a vast, hot, perpetually busy space, a world unto itself. The head cook, known in England as the master cook, and in France as the crew or maître cuisine, held enormous authority. Below him or her, And yes, while male cooks dominated great houses, women frequently managed the kitchens of lesser establishments, were spit boys, cooks, pastry cooks, and a small army of helpers whose sole job was to fetch, carry, chop, stir, stew, and clean under constant direction. The kitchen fire, unlike the hall fire, truly never went out. Bread baking, the preparation of stocks and broths that would simmer for hours, the roasting of meats that might need 4 or 5 hours over a turning spit. All of this demanded continuous flame. The boy whose job it was to turn the spit boy or turnspit, was one of the most miserable of all castle servants. He sat beside the open fire for hours at a stretch, turning the iron handle that rotated the heavy spit, ensuring evenly. The heat was ferocious. Burns were common. In some wealthy households, a mechanical device called a turnspit dog was used, a small breed of dog placed inside a wheel connected to the spit, whose running turned the mechanism. But in most establishments, this task fell to a human child, often a young boy, who learned quickly that inattention meant scorched meat, and with it. While the kitchen prepared for the day ahead, other servants attended to water. Fresh water was not a given in a castle. Wells existed within many castle courtyards, and larger establishments had elaborate lead or wooden systems that channeled water from springs to cisterns. But in many cases, water still had to be carried. From the well to the kitchen, from the well to the laundry, from the well to the stables. Buckets held perhaps 10 to 15 pounds of water each. A servant who made a dozen trips to the well before breakfast had already lifted more weight than many modern workers do in a day. The laundry presented its own ancient challenge. Washing cloth by hand, and in a castle, the volume of linen was extraordinary, required heated water, lye ash soap, and tremendous physical effort. Sheets, tablecloths, undergarments, towels, and the endless supply of napkins used at table all required regular washing. The washerwomen, typically organized under a head laundress, began soaking and beating cloth in wooden tubs early in the morning. The work was hard on the hands and back. Lye was caustic. In winter, the work was miserable beyond description. And yet, within all of this, within the darkness, the cold stone floors, the weight of water buckets and armloads of firewood, there was order, a sophisticated, hierarchical, deeply regimented order that governed every aspect of castle life. Bulum nos, Hayadar si v seref, his mitzin yasendeki. To understand the life of a castle servant, one must first understand that the word servant in the medieval world did not carry quite the same connotations it does today. In modern speech, a servant is someone a low social status employed in domestic labor. In the medieval castle, the picture was considerably more complex. The great households of medieval Europe were organized according to a principle that historians call service. And service was not merely a practical arrangement, but a social and even moral concept. To serve a great lord well was considered an honorable occupation. The household of a duke or an earl was populated not just by lowly laborers, but by gentlemen and even minor nobles who waited at table, carried dispatches, managed accounts, and oversaw the lord's properties. These men were called the household knights, the esquires, the gentlemen of the chamber. They were servants in the broad sense, but they were emphatically not social if inferiors. That the household was stratified with almost bureaucratic precision. At the very top of the servant hierarchy stood the steward, in England called the seneschal or lord steward, who managed the entire household. He oversaw accounts, supervised all other staff, represented the lords in lords' interests in local matters, and commanded enormous prestige. A great lord steward was often a knight himself, a man of genuine social standing who wielded real authority. He sat at a high position at table, ate well, and was treated with considerable respect by everyone except the lord and family themselves. Below the steward came a constellation of departmental heads. The marshal oversaw the stables and the ceremonial aspects of the household. The chamberlain managed the lord's private apartments, the chamber, and controlled access to the lord's person, making him one of the most politically influential figures in the household, despite the domestic nature of his role. The treasurer kept the accounts. The chaplain oversaw spiritual life and often functioned as the household's educated administrator, handling correspondence and legal documents. Each of these senior figures controlled a department, doffed by numerous subordinates, and those subordinates in turn supervised workers below them. The kitchen had its own internal hierarchy, from master, cook, down to scullion. The stables had their marshal, their grooms, their stable boys. The hall had its ushers, who controlled entry and maintained order. The buttery, the room from which ale and wine were dispensed, had its butler, whose title survives to this day. The butler, incidentally, is a perfect example of how the meaning of words has shifted. In the medieval household, the butler, from the old French bouteiller, was the officer in charge of the bottles, the casks, the wine cellar. He was responsible for acquiring, storing, and dispensing the household supply of wine, ale, and other beverages. This was a significant role. Wine was expensive and required careful management. Theft from the wine cellar was a constant. A dishonest butler could ruin a lord's household accounts or sell the lord's wine for personal profit. The butler, therefore, had to be trusted absolutely, and in many households held a position of real authority. Below the senior officers and the departmental heads lay the vast middle tier of the household, the working servants whose labor made daily life possible. These were the grooms, the pages, the panthers, who managed the bread supply, the kitchen workers, the chambermaids, the laundresses, the porters, the gardeners. Their daily lives were governed by routine, so rigid approached the ritualistic. Pages deserve particular attention, for they occupied a fascinating and often misunderstood position in the castle hierarchy. A page was typically a boy of noble birth, perhaps the son of a minor knight or even a substantial lord, sent to serve in a greater household as part of his education. Pages served as terliberal, carried messages, attended to the personal needs of the lord and lady, and learned the customs, etiquette, and skills of aristocratic life by immersion. They were servants, but they were servants in training to become lords and knights themselves. Service, in this sense, was a school. A page might begin his household career at age 7 and serve in that capacity until around 14, when he would be elevated to the rank of esquire, a more advanced stage of training in which he learned the arts of war, horsemanship, and courtly behavior. The esquires, in turn, tended the lord at a higher level, caring for his armor, accompanying him on journeys, and in time, if fortune favored them, being knighted themselves. This system, in which noble sons served in the households of greater nobles, was one of the key mechanisms by which the aristocratic class reproduced its values, skills, and social networks. Paids, who served well in a powerful household, made connections that could define his entire adult career. The lord whose house he served might become his patron, advancing his interests, arranging advantageous marriages for him, supporting him in legal disputes. Service was not degrading. It was strategic. For those of genuinely lower birth, the sons and daughters of peasants, craftsmen, or free laborers who entered castle service, the picture was different, but not without its opportunities. Castle service offered something that life in a village could rarely provide: regular food, some degree of physical security within castle walls, and the possibility, however, of advancement. A clever and hardworking kitchen boy might rise to become an undercook, then a cook, then in time a master cook, who commanded a substantial wage and considerable household prestige. A laundress, who proved herself reliable and discreet, might rise to the position of lady's maid, entering the intimate orbit of the lord's family and gaining influence thereby. But such advancement required not just skill and hard work, but all something harder to guarantee: the favorable attention of those above. Castle service was in many respects a world of patronage and personality. A servant who caught the eye of a sympathetic superior might rise quickly. One who offended, however inadvertently, might find themselves dismissed with little recourse. There were no contracts of employment in the modern sense. A servant served at the lord's pleasure. Custom and practical necessity offered some protection. It would have been productive for a lord to dismiss all his skilled staff without cause, but legal protection was minimal. Bulum thrius, sabas, sabasatri, salui, rionas. By the time the castle's bells rang the hour of prime, approximately 6 in the morning, as the eastern sky began to pale, the household was already deep in its morning labors. The fires were burning, water had been carried, the kitchens were in full operation. Now came the work of preparing the castle itself for the day. The great hall was the heart of the castle's communal life. It was here that the household ate together, not as equals, for the lord and his family and guests sat at the high table on a raised dais at one end, while the household staff and lesser guests sat long trestle tables in the main body of the hall. The great hall was also a place of business, of entertainment, of justice, of ceremony. it needed to be maintained in a state appropriate to these functions. The floor of the Great Hall in most medieval castles was covered with rushes, dried reeds strewn on or beaten floor. These rushes served as insulation against cold, as a soft surface underfoot, and, as a kind of absorbed layer, collected the inevitable detritus of communal life. Food scraps, ale, dog droppings, the occasional lost item. Dogs were omnipresent in medieval halls. They lay beside the fire, begged at table, fought over scraps, and were generally tolerated as a feature of domestic life. Their presence did not improve the condition of the floor rushes. The rushes were therefore changed regularly. How regularly depended on the wealth and standards of the household. In a great establishment, fresh rushes might be laid weekly, mixed with sweet-smelling herbs such as lavender, mint, wormwood, and meadowsweet to combat the smell. The task of removing old rushes and laying new ones was assigned to general servants, and it was deeply unpleasant work. The old rushes, packed down and soaked with weeks of spillage and organic matter, were heavy, malodorous, and in warm weather, alive with insects. They were raked up, carried out, and disposed of, spread on the kitchen garden perhaps, where they would rot to useful compost. Once the floor was refreshed, the trestle tables had to be set up. Unlike the permanent tables that stood on unraised daises in some halls, the majority of the tables in the main hall body were trestle tables. Boards laid across wooden supports could be dismantled and moved when needed. This flexibility allowed the hall to serve multiple functions: dining space in the morning and evening, open meeting space during the day, even sleeping space at night for those lower servants who had no other quarters. Setting the tables required not just assembling the trestles and boards, but covering them with linen cloths. In a great household, of fine white linen washed, dried, and carefully folded in the laundry. Then came the tableware, wooden bowls and platters for the lower tables, pewter or silver for the high table, bread trenchers that would serve as plates for certain dishes, knives and spoons. Forks were not in common use in most of medieval Europe until the late medieval period, and even then slowly penetrated ordinary custom. The laying of the table was itself a ritualized procedure, especially at the high table where the lord and honored guests would dine. The pantler, the officer responsible for the bread and table linen, supervised this operation carefully. Salt was placed prominently on the table. The salt cellar was not merely a practical object. It was a social marker. To sit above the salt, nearer the Lord, indicated higher status. To sit below the salt indicated lower rank. The phrase survives in English to this day. While the hall was being prepared, the personal servants of the lord and lady were at work in the private chambers. The lord's chamber was typically on the upper floors of the castle, keep, or residential wing, accessible by a narrow spiral staircase that wound through the thickness of the castle wall. The lord's personal servant, his valet or gentleman of the chamber, would enter quietly, lay the fire if it had not already been tended, and begin preparing for the lord's rising. In the medieval period, What we would call a morning routine was similarly elaborate, differently structured. There was no indoor plumbing, so washing involved a basin of water, ideally warmed, and a cloth. The Lord might wash his hands and face, and perhaps rinse his mouth. Full bathing was less frequent than popular imagination sometimes suggests, but neither was it as rare as a different popular imagination claims. Great households had bathing tubs, large wooden vessels that could be filled with water over the kitchen fire and carried upstairs. On bath days, this was a significant logistical operation involving multiple servants carrying heavy buckets up flights of stairs. The tub would be lined with linen cloths to make the rough wood more comfortable, and the lord or lady would bathe while surroundings with heated towels and clean clothing. Dressing, too, required assistance. Medieval clothing, particularly for the nobility, was not designed for self-sufficiency. Layers of linen undergarments, woolen outer garments, complex fastenings, laces, buttons, buckles, hooks, required another pair of hands. The personal body servant, the valet for a man, the lady's maid for a woman, dressed their charge with practiced efficiency born of long familiarity. They knew their lord or lady's preferences, their physical quirks, the particular way a sleeve needed to be adjusted or a buckle tightened to avoid rubbing. This intimate physical proximity between servant and lord created a relationship quite unlike any other in the castle hierarchy. A body servant knew things about the lord that no one else knew: his moods, his health, his physical condition, his habit. This knowledge was a kind of power, and it was understood as such. A trusted body servant was therefore in an extraordinarily delicate position. Too familiar, and they overstepped. Too reserved, and they failed to provide the comfortable, personalized service that was expected. The best purse servants navigated this narrow channel with extraordinary social skill. Bullum quater, mutfagan kalbi. Sofra isin pca masanat. The castle kitchen was, without question, the most intensely antsly active space in the entire establishment. In a great household that might serve 100 or more people at the main midday meal, the dinner, the kitchen was already running at full capacity before sunrise and would not truly rest until the last of the evening meal had been cleared and the fires banked for the night. The medieval diet, as it varied by rank and season, was deeply influenced by the religious calendar. The Christian year prescribed fasting on Fridays, Saturdays, the eve of major feast days, and throughout the 40 days of Lent, meaning that, on such days, meat forbidden and the kitchen shifted to an entirely different repertoire. Fish, both fresh and preserved, vegetables, eggs, cheese, tringed-based, fish-based dishes replaced the roasted meats, potages of meat, and elaborate meat-based preparations that dominated the feast day table. For the noble household, the challenge of fasting days was not scarcity but creativity. How did you produce a meal impressive enough for a lord's table without meat? The answer, developed over centuries by skilled cooks, was remarkable culinary ingenuity. Fish could be prepared in astonishing variety: roasted, poached, baked in pastry, served in spiced sauces, preserved in salt or vinegar, smoked, dried. Almond milk, made by pounding almonds and mixing them with water, substituted for dairy in many preparations. Eggs, technically permitted on fast days in most periods, could be prepared in dozens of ways. And vegetables, often undervalued in accounts of medieval cooking, appeared in elaborate preparations far more sophisticated than the boiled greens of popular imagination. On ordinary meat days, the roasting fire was the kitchen's centerpiece. The great open hearth was designed for large-scale roasting. Whole animals might be turned on spits over the flames, from a suckling pig to, in the most extravagant feasts, an entire ox. The timing of roasting required experience and judgment. There were no thermometers. A cook judged doneness by color, by the way the juices ran, by the smell of the meat, by the feel of it when pressed. These judgments were acquired through years of practice and represented genuine technical skill. Alongside the roasting fire, cauldrons of various sizes hung on iron cranes over the heat, or rested on iron trivets. In these, the potages, thick, sustaining stews of meat or vegetables with grain, spiced and seasoned with whatever the household could afford. For the lower tables, the pottage might be simple, beans or peas with salt pork, thickened with grain. For the high table, it might be refined. A white pottage of chicken in almond milk, seasoned with sugar, ginger, and cinnamon, garnished with anise seed and gold leaf in the most extravagant presentations. Spices were extraordinarily valuable in the medieval kitchen, and their use on the high table was a direct expression of wealth and status. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, saffron, cardamom. These were imported from the East through complex trade networks and priced accordingly. A lord who served well-spiced dishes to his guests was advertising his prosperity. The spice cabinet in a great kitchen was locked, its contents carefully measured out by the master cook for each preparation. Spice theft was a serious matter. Bread occupied a central place in the medieval diet at every level of society. The castle's bakehouse, a separate building from the main kitchen, usually, due to the fire risk, produced bread continuously. Different qualities of bread were produced for different ranks. Man shape, a fine white bread made from bolted flour for the lord's high table. Maslin, a mixed bread for the household, and coarser whole grain loaves for the lower servants and laborers. The distinction in bread quality was so fixed a part of the social hierarchy that it was encoded in formal household regulations. The bakehouse was managed by the baker, who in a large household was a skilled professional. The baker had to calculate quantities carefully. Too little bread and the household went hungry. Too much, and it spoiled and was wasted. In practice, bread that had gone slightly stale was not wasted but repurposed. Thickened into potagers, used as trenchers, edible plates cut from yesterday's bread, or dried and ground into breadcrumbs for use in sauces. The pastry cook occupied a particularly prestigious position in the larger kitchens. The preparation of pastry, both savory pastry encasing meat or fish fillings, the great pies called coffins and sweet pastry preparations for the dessert course required technical skill of a high order. The pastry itself had to be mixed, rested, rolled, shaped, and baked in the bakehouse oven. The oven temperature was judged by experienced bakers using techniques unchanged for centuries. A handful of flour into the oven, the color of its browning indicating whether the temperature was right. Too hot and the pastry burned, too cool and it remained in doughy. The kitchen's work was also profoundly seasonal. Before the era of refrigeration, the castle's kitchen had to manage its food supply in harmony with the rhythms of the natural year. Autumn was slaughter season, the time when the animals that could not be fed through the winter were killed and their meat preserved. Salting, smoking, and drying were the primary techniques. Whole carcasses were butchered. The cuts that would not keep were eaten immediately at autumn feasts, while the rest was packed into barrels with salt or hung in the smokehouses to cure. A well-managed castle's larder in winter might contain barrels of salted pork and beef, smoked hams and bacon, dried fish of various kinds, preserved eels, salted herrings, stockfish, dried and preserved cod, imported from Scandinavia, as well as dried pulses, stored grain, hard cheeses, dried fruits, and the precious stores of spices in their locked chests, managing these stores through the winter months, calculating what could be consumed and what must be held in reserve, was a major responsibility of the pantler and the cook working in consultation with the steward. Fresh food was always preferred when available. The castle's gardens provided vegetables, leeks, onions, garlic, cabbages, peas, beans, and herbs for cooking and medicine. The castle's orchards produced apples, pears, plums, and cherries. Hunting in the lord's forests brought fresh venison and game birds. The castle's fish ponds. Many medieval establishments maintained elaborate stew ponds specifically to breed fresh fish, provided carp, bream, and other species year-round, might be brought by local fishermen under the lord's control. The sea coast within a day's journey meant fresh saltwater fish could be carried to the castle. Bilain sin gondius yondachimgie v sorgelen goreler. By the middle of the morning, the castle's daily administration was in full operation. The steward, having consulted with the master cook regarding the day's menu and available provisions, would turn to his other duties. These were considerable. The medieval household ran on accounts. Every commodity consumed or purchased had to be recorded, every expenditure noted, the house accounts balanced regularly and presented to the lord for review. The steward oversaw this process. The actual work of accounting fell to the household's clerks, educated men who could read, write, and calculate in an era when such skills were far from universal. The account rolls that survive from great medieval households are extraordinary documents. They record, in meticulous detail, the purchases of the kitchen, the laundry, the stables, and every other department of the household. From them, historians can reconstruct the castle's diet, trace the origins of its supplies, calculate the size of its workforce, and understand the rhythms of its year. They record not just what was bought, but from whom, at what price, in what quantity. and for what specific purpose. The clerk who maintained these records had a demanding job that combined the skills of accountant, inventory manager, and legal secretary. The castle's porter, stationed at the gate, managed one of the most strategically important positions in the household. His role was to control who entered and who left. No one passed through the castle gate without the porter's knowledge. He questioned strangers, turned away those without legitimate business, admitted tradespeople and merchants who brought supplies, and reported unusual arrivals to the steward in times of political tension or military threat. Porter's function was overtly defensive. But even in peacetime, control of the gate was essential to the soul's security and the Lord's privacy. Traders and merchants arrived throughout the morning. The butcher brought fresh meat. The poulterer brought birds, chickens, ducks, geese, and in season, game birds of various kinds. The herbalist spicer might arrive with a delivery of condiments and spices. The linen draper might bring cloth for table linens. Each transaction was overseen by the relevant household officer, the buyer in the kitchen, the pantler for linen supplies, and recorded by the clerk. Payment was often made not in cash, but in credit, tallied on notched sticks, called tally sticks, and settled periodically. The stables occupied a world of their own within the castle complex. Great households maintained substantial numbers of horses, riding horses for the lord and his knights, destriers for battle, palfreys for ladies, pack horses for transporting goods, oxen for agricultural work on the lord's estates. Each animal required daily feeding, watering, grooming, and care. The grooms, skilled craftsmen of the stable, knew each horse's temperament, its dietary needs, its training. A well-trained destrier was worth a fortune. Injuring such an animal through negligence was a serious offense. The farrier, the blacksmith who shod horses, was either resident in the castle or visited regularly. Horseshoes wore down and had to be replaced. Iron tools broke and needed repair. The castle's smithy, where present was a busy place throughout the day, hammering, hissing of hot metal in water, the smell of hot iron and coal. The smith who worked there ranked among the more prestigious craftsmen in the castle, his skill essential to the functioning of the entire establishment. The castle's laundry work continued through the morning into the afternoon. In large establishments, laundry was a continuous operation, the sheer volume of cloth used in a medieval castle. Tablecloths changed frequently, bedding washed regularly, personal linen kept as clean as circumstances allowed, meant that the laundresses were rarely idle. The work cycle ran from soaking, through washing and rinsing, to wringing, hanging to dry, and final folding and storage. In warm weather, cloth dried on bushes and hedges in the castle grounds. In winter, it had to be dried near fires, which required care to prevent scorching. The castle's chapel was another center of activity. Mass was celebrated daily. The lord and lady typically attended daily mass in their private chapel, accompanied by members of the household. The chaplain, who served the castle's spiritual needs, was often one of the most educated individuals in the establishment and frequently performed duties well beyond the purely religious. In many households, the chaplain served effectively as the Lord's secretary, writing letters, drafting documents, maintaining correspondence, and advising on matters of law or theology. The castle chapel itself was maintained by the chaplain's assistants, the sacristans, who kept the altar cloths clean, the candles supplied, the sacred vessels polished, and the chapel in order. Children in the castle. Both the Lord's own children and the pages and other young servants had their education supervised. Of quality, typically supervised the education of the young girls in the household, teaching them reading, needlework, music, and the social arts. Pages received instruction in Latin, courtly manners, the rudiments of accounts and law. In the most sophisticated households, a tutor might be employed specifically for this purpose. But much education was informal, learned by watching, by doing, by being corrected when wrong. Bill Looms says, Boekschief, be a fate zia fidvi Jews in the main meal of the day. The main meal of dinner was typically served in the early to mid-afternoon, around noon or 1 o'clock in the larger, more active households, and sometimes as late as 2 or 3. The timing varied by season, social custom, and the specific practices of the establishment. But whenever it came, dinner was the great ceremony of the castle day. The usher of the hall, the officer responsible for maintaining order and ceremony in the great hall, presided over the arrangements. As the time for dinner approached, the usher would ensure the tables were properly set, the salt cellar in place, the bread trenchers arranged. He would assign seats, a matter of considerable delicacy, since rank determined where one sat, and to be placed incorrectly or to be displaced from a seat one believed was one's right was a serious social insult. When the lord and lady were ready to dine, they processed to the hall with their senior household officers and guests. This entrance. It was a small ceremony. The company rose as the lord entered. He took his place at the high table, elevated on the dais. Visible to the entire hall, his family and honored guests arranged themselves around him according to rank, the most honored seated at his right hand. The serving of food followed a precise choreography. The ceremonial aspects of serving at the high table were elaborate and had been codified in household regulations and manuals of etiquette over centuries. The server who bore the Lord's dish approached from a specific direction, knelt, bowed as custom required, presented the dish, and withdrew. The carver, whose specialty was the carving and portioning of meat, worked at a serving table near the high table, preparing portions with practiced skill and presenting them to the Lord with appropriately deferential behavior. The word carving barely begins to cover art. A skilled carver knew the correct cuts for dozens of different animals and birds, the specific terms for each cut, many of them specialized terminology that required years to master, and the appropriate portions for different ranks. The cupbearer attended to the Lord's drinking. The Lord's cup, typically silver or gold, depending on his wealth, was filled, presented on bended knee, the cupbearer earning away as drink, so as not observe the private act of eating and drinking at too close quarters. This etiquette of averting the eyes during intimate moments of consumption was genuine, a recognition that eating and drinking were in some sense vulnerable acts, and that the Lord's dignity required that servants not observe them with undue directness. The variety of dishes served at a great feast was staggering. The courses, called removes or services, might include a first course of potages and boiled meats, a second course of roasted meats with sauces and in pastry dishes, a third course of lighter preparations, fruits, and sweet dishes. Each remove might itself contain a dozen or more separate dishes placed simultaneously on the table in the fashion called service française. All dishes brought out together and placed along the length of the table, allowing diners to choose what they wished. Waiting for a course to arrive was not the medieval model. Choice was the aristocratic prerogative. Between course, entertainers might perform. A minstrel stationed in the minstrel's gallery, a balcony at the upper end of the hall, played music throughout the meal. At great feasts, there might be performances between courses. A juggler, an acrobat, a jester, a harper. These entertainers a semi-permanent place in great households, or traveled as independent professionals. Their position in the social hierarchy was ambiguous, skilled and valued, but socially marginal in a way that the more regular household servants were not. While all this ceremony played out at the high table, the lower tables were served with rather less elaboration, but no less food. The household servants ate substantially. One of the genuine attractions of castle service was the guarantee of adequate food, something that could not always be assumed in the medieval economy. The ordinary household members received bread, elle, and portions of the less prestigious cuts of the meat upserved state. The head and feet of animals, the offal, the cheaper pieces that the Lord's table would not have seen on great feast days, when the Lord entertained lavishly and the kitchens produced at maximum capacity. Even the lower tables might eat surprisingly well. Elle was the universal drink of the household's lower ranks. It was consumed in large quantities throughout the day, not primarily for its alcoholic content, though medieval ale was certainly alcoholic, because it was nourishing, safer than uncertain water supplies, and simply the established drink of ordinary life. Wine was reserved for the high table, for honored guests, and occasionally for senior household officers. The distinction between who drank wine and who drank ale was as socially legible as the distinction between who sat above and below the salt. After dinner, the hall was cleared. The trestle tables might be dismantled if the space was needed for other purposes. The Lord might retire to his chamber for a period of rest. The postprandial rest was a medically recommended practice in medieval health theory, which followed the humoral theory of medicine and held that vigorous physical activity immediately after eating was harmful to digestion. Servants took advantage of this quieter period to complete midday tasks, eat their own meals, and rest briefly before the afternoon's work resumed. Biluim sechi, oglidin santra, ilsa, ilsanavlar, bumum vim vayanerum. Dune in the castle was a time of maintenance and craft. The physical fabric of the castle required constant attention. Stone walls, while vastly more durable than timber construction, still required ongoing care. Mortar between stones could weaken and need repointing. Lead flashings on roofs developed cracks. Wooden floors, shutters, and doors warped, rotted, and broke. The castle's permanent staff of builders and craftsmen, masons, carpenters, plumbers working in lead, glaziers where glass windows were present, worked continuously to keep the structure in repair. The garden occupied the afternoons of those servants assigned to its care. Medieval gardens were not merely ornamental. They were practical extensions of the kitchen and the physician's art. The kitchen garden supplied the vegetables, herbs, and salad plants that supplemented the castle's diet. The physic garden, the herb garden devoted to medicinal plants, supplied the herbs that formed the basis of the castle's medical care. Medieval medicine was largely herbal, supplemented by the practices of bloodletting, purging, and other interventions derived from classical Greek and Arabic medical theory. The herb garden therefore held plants such as feverfew, used for headaches, valerian, used as a sedative, plantain, used for wounds, and dozens of others, each with its established medical application. The castle's women, the lady and her attendants, typically occupied the afternoon with needlework, music, reading, and conversation. The ladies' chamber was the domestic center of female castle life. Here, the gentlewomen and ladies-in-waiting who attended the lady of the castle gathered to sew, embroider, talk, read aloud, and entertain. The production of fine embroidery was a major occupation of aristocratic women and their female servants alike. The elaborate embroidered textiles that survive from the medieval period, altar cloths, wall hangings, vestments, represent an enormous collective labor, much of it female. Spinning and weaving occupied those female servants who were not engaged in the more refined arts of embroidery. The production of cloth was still largely a domestic industry in much of the medieval period, though the growth of commercial textile production in centers, Flanders, Florence, and later, England, gradually shifting this toward a more industrial model. In the castle household, spinning wheels hummed, looms clattered, and the women who worked them produced the cloth, from which the household's linens and working garments were made. The afternoon was also the time for medical and social needs of the household. Servants who had fallen ill were attended by whoever in the household had medical knowledge, often the chaplain, who might have some medical education, or the lady herself, who in many households was the effective medical officer for the entire establishment. Women of the noble class were frequently expected to have substantial knowledge, herbal, and wound care, the care of sick servants, applying poultices, administering her herbal preparations, overseeing the rest and diet prescribed by medical theory, was a genuine part of the lady's domestic responsibilities. A servant who fell seriously ill presented a practical problem as well as a human one. The work they did had to be redistributed among the remaining staff. In a large household with many redundancies, this might be managed easily. In smaller establishments, where each servant's role was critical. Illness could create real difficulties. Medieval employment relationships were not entirely without obligation on the employer's side. A lord whose servant fell ill was not, in principle, required to dismiss them immediately. Custom and Christian obligation encouraged some degree of care for sick household members, but the extent of this care varied enormously, and a servant whose illness was prolonged could not necessarily count on indefinite support. Biawimuyu, Bugis and Examenjing, Sund. Gumbargmandenden Senver faded and the early dark of a medieval winter evening, or the long golden light of a summer evening, depending on the season, settled over the castle. The household's routines shifted once more. Candles and end torches, critical. Before the age of gas and electric, light was expensive, demanding, and never fully adequate to the needs of active life after dark. The castle used several types of artificial lighting. Rush lights, the stems of common rushes soaked in rendered fat, were the cheapest and most widely used. They burned with a dim, yellowish flame and required constant attention as they burned through their length. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, burned somewhat more brightly and lasted longer. Beeswax candles, far more expensive, produced the clearest, brightest, and most pleasant light, with less smoke and smell than tallow. They were therefore reserved for the chapel and the Lord's private chambers. The chandler, the officer responsible for the castle's supply of candles and lighting materials, was a moderately important household official. In large establishments, candles were made within the castle. In smaller ones, they were purchased from local chandlers. The quantity required was as substantial. The great hall needed numerous torches set in iron brackets on the walls. Private chambers needed candles on stands or in hanging holders. The chapel needed candles for the altar. Even the kitchens and service areas needed light in the dark winter months when the working day extended well beyond sunset. As evening approached, the servants responsible for the hall lit the torches and candles in preparation for supper. For supper, the second main meal of the day, supper was typically lighter than dinner. Fewer courses, less elaborate service, though the essential ceremonies of the high table were maintained. By the time supper was concluded, the hall would be in the full flicker of torchlight, the smoke rising to the louvered opening in the roof through which it was supposed to escape. Though in practice, the great hall was often thick with smoke, a constant irritant to eyes and lungs. After supper, the Lord and his company might engage in entertainment, music, dancing, storytelling, board games, or simply conversation. The minstrel might play through the evening. A traveling harper or singer might entertain the assembly with songs in the vernacular or Latin. Romantic tales of courtly love, heroic ballads, devotional hymns, and chess were popular. Various board games with names that have since been forgotten occupied those who preferred competition to passive entertainment. The servants who were not required for evening service took their own supper. In the kitchens or the lower hall, the kitchen servants might eat while still working, snatching food between tasks as the rhythm of service demanded. Others gathered in whatever common space the household provided. A room off the main kitchen, a corner of the lower hall, ate together in the companionable way that communal domestic service tended to encourage. These were the moments of genuine social life for the lower servants. Eating together, talking, joking, complaining, gossiping. The servant community within a large castle was a tightly knit social world, with its own friendships, rivalries, romances, and conflicts. Sleep arrangements in the medieval castle were quite different. What modern habits suggest. Actual framed beds with mattresses were valuable objects, and ownership of a proper bed was itself a marker of some social status. The lord and lady had their bed, of course, a great piece of furniture with mattress, feather or wool stuffed bolster, linen sheets, and multiple layers of heavy wool blankets. Curtains hung around the bed on wooden frames, providing privacy and some insulation against the cold of the chamber. Senior household officers might have individual sleeping spaces, a small room off the main chambers, or a partitioned corner of a larger room, but that the majority of castle servants slept communally, in the great hall on the floor among the rushes, in the kitchens near the warmth of the dying fire, in the stables near the animals whose body heat provided some warmth. Pallets, thin mattresses of straw or wool-stuffed fabric, were rolled out at night and rolled up in the morning. In a large household, the hall at night was a forest of sleeping bodies. The concept of privacy as modern individuals understand it was largely absent from castle life. The lord himself had very little of what we would call privacy. He was constantly attended, watched, served. His body servants slept in or just outside his chamber. In the grandest establishments, a chamberlain or senior servant slept literally at the foot of the lord's bed or across the threshold of the chamber door. This was not considered an imposition. It was considered appropriate and necessary. The lord's safety required constant attendance. His needs, should they arise in the night, thirst, illness, a sudden decision requiring a messenger, demanded that a servant be immediately available. The night brought its own duties. The castle's gates were locked at curfew. The word itself derives from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire, the signal to damp down the hearths for safety at night's end. The night watchmen took their positions on the walls and at the gate. In peacetime, this was tedious work, walking the ramparts, watching the dark fields and roads, listening for unusual sounds, making sure no fire had broken out within the castle and no unauthorized persons were attempting entry. In times of military tension, the watch was a genuinely anxious duty. The night watchmen were not drawn from the highest tier of servants, but from liable men who'd be trusted to stay awake through the long-called hours. They moved in pairs to keep each other alert and to provide mutual witness if anything happened. They marked the passage of hours by the castle's bells. Those who served as bell ringers would be woken by a prior arrangement to sound the hours through the night. A watchman who slept his post was subject to serious punishment. The consequence of an unguarded gate could be catastrophe for the entire household. Biluim knife, mefsimlar ve baterimlar, his metzi. Siedhek viminin in Ritmi, the year of a castle servant shaped not just by the day we've been exploring, but by the larger rhythms of the seasons and the ecclesiastical calendar. These broader cycles determine the character of the work, the quantity of the food, the nature, the earth, and the very atmosphere of the household. Christmas. The great midwinter feast that ran from Christmas Day through Epiphany on the 6th of January was the most elaborate and demanding period of the servant's year. For 12 days, the Lord was expected to entertain generously, to maintain open house for his tenants and neighbors, to feast and celebrate on a scale demonstrated his wealth, his generosity, and his lordly status. This was not merely personal preference. It was a social obligation. A lord who failed to maintain appropriate Christmas hospitality was failing in one of his fundamental duties community. The practical implications for the servants were immense. The kitchens worked at their highest capacity. Enormous quantities of food had to be prepared. Roasted meats in abundance, pastries and pies of every kind, sweet preparations. The special holiday foods that custom required. The halls were decorated with evergreens, holly, ivy, laurel, and hung with candles and torches until they blazed with light. The hall fire was built to exceptional height and maintained through the night. Entertainers of every kind, minstrels, tumblers, bear baiters, musicians, players performing dramatic pieces that were ancestors of later theatrical tradition, were engaged. The Lord of Misrule, a figure found in various forms across European Christmas tradition, was in some households a genuine institution. A servant or junior household member, appointed to preside over the Christmas revels, empowered to command the ordinary rules of social hierarchy, to be temporarily reversed or mocked. Lords served servants. Servants gave orders. Everything was briefly topsy-turvy. This ritual inversion of order, licensed but by tradition and firmly bounded in time, was both a safety valve for social tensions and a reaffirmation of the normal order. Because the 12 days ended, hierarchy reasserted itself exactly as before. Easter, coming after the 40 days of Lenten abstinence, was celebrated with relief and abundance. The fast was broken with the consumption of foods that had been forbidden throughout Lent: eggs, cheese, meat. The servants who had subsisted on fish and vegetables through 40 days of cold late winter experienced genuine pleasure in the return of roasted meats and dairy dishes. Midsummer brought its own celebrations, bonfires, and in the castle yard, on Midsummer Eve, the feast of St. John the Baptist. Harvest time was a period of intense outdoor labor on the Lord's estate lands, in which castle servants might be called out to assist with the harvest. An archaic labor service that, depending on the legal status of particular servants, might be either a customary obligation or a voluntary tribution. The agricultural rhythm of the estate itself touched castle life constantly. The Lord's wealth came ultimately from land, from the rents, services, and agricultural production of his tenants. The castle was the administrative center of this agricultural enterprise. When harvest failed, as it did with terrible regularity in the medieval period, particularly in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, when a series of catastrophic wet summers ruined harvests across northern Europe. The effects rippled through the castle household. Food stores were drawn down more rapidly. Purchases of provisions became more expensive as scarcity drove prices up. The lord's income derived from tenant rents that might be paid in grain. The household's budget tightened. Bola dies hastalik ulum bis mitsinin in kadiri. The medieval world was intimate in a way that modern society rarely experiences. Life expectancy was shorter, infant mortality was high, epidemic disease was a constant threat, and injury from accident or violence carried a much higher risk of death than in an era of modern medicine. The castle, despite its wealth, was not immune to any of this. Disease moved through the castle population as it moved all medieval communities. The bubonic plague, the Black Death, that swept through big Europe beginning in 33 and 47 and recurred in resurgent killing, was the most catastrophic epidemic, killing between a third and a half of Europe's population, in some estimates. But before and after the Great Plague, ordinary diseases killed servants as they killed everyone. Fevers, dysentery, called the bloody flux, pneumonia, the coughing sickness, typhoid, smallpox, and the 100 ailments that crowded communal living and inadequate sanitation brought in their train. A servant who fell seriously ill faced a difficult situation. The castle might have access to the lord's physician. Trained medical practitioner was a luxury in some establishments, but a fixture in the wealthiest. More commonly, treatment fell to the lady of the household. The chaplain, with his knowledge of medical texts, or the wise woman of the local village, whose practical herbal knowledge, accumulated it over generations, was often more effective than the learned theory of formally trained physicians. The death of a senior household official left a practical gap that needed to be filled. The death of a lower servant was a smaller practical disruption, but still required attention. Medieval employers were not heartless. There is considerable evidence of lords making charitable provision for old or incapacitated servants. Pensions were sometimes granted to long-serving household members who could no longer work. Food and shelter might be provided in the castle or on the estate. But such provisions depended on the lord's personal goodwill and were not a legal right. For servants who survived to old age, retirement in any modern sense did not exist. One worked until one could not work, then depended on the charity of family, the lord, or the church. The monasteries and hospitals that existed throughout medieval Europe provided some care for the aged and ill-poor. Servants with long service records and good relationships with the family they had served might receive more systematic support. But the vulnerability of the old servant, having given the best years of their life to another's household, was real. The lives of servants left relatively few traces in the historical record. the great accounts of the household chronicle grain purchases and wine expenditures, but rarely name the individuals who made those purchases or who consumed that grain. We know the names of lords, of senior household officers, of chaplains, whose literacy left written traces. The nameless majority who cooked, cleaned, carried water, tended fires, and made the whole enterprise function are known to us mostly in aggregate. As a category, as a payroll line, as a demographic in the records of purchase and consumption. And yet, those lives were real and complex and worthy of understanding. The woman who spent 40 years in the laundry of a great castle, washing the same lord's tablecloths decade after decade. The boy who turned a spit from age 7 to age 12 before graduating to some other kitchen role. The groom who knew every horse in the stable by name and temperament. These were complete human lives, shaped by work and community, by loyalty and frustration, by the small pleasures of a good meal and the large worries of illness and insecurity. They inhabited a world of stone and fire and cold water, of hierarchy and ritual and seasonal abundance and winter scarcity. They kept, in their daily labor, the great household alive, and in doing so, they made possible the political, military, and cultural achievements that fill the history books. Achievements built, always the invisible scaffolding of their ceaseless, unglamorous, essential work. Bil Lulun's, Sisijase, Satu Yorkin. And so we return to where we began, to the castle in the deep of the night, when the torches have burned low and the great hall is quiet, lit only by the fading glow of the banked fire, and the guttering stubs of candles not yet extinguished. The lords sleep, the honored guests sleep. The dogs stretch out before the dying hearth, twitching in their dreams. On the walls the watts pace their slow circuits, breathing the cold night air, marking the stars. In the gatehouse, the porter sits by his small fire, half asleep, but always half alert. In the stables, the horses shift and settle. In the kitchen, one sleepy boy has been left to keep the fire from going out entirely, sitting in the warmth and fighting the pull of sleep. The castle is never fully still. It breathes in its own way. The drip of condensation from stone walls, the creak of old timbers, the distant sound of owls in the darkness beyond the walls, the smell of it at night. Hay, the faint residue of the day's cooking, the animal warmth of many sleeping bodies, is the smell of a living community at rest. By 3 or 4 in the morning, the first servant stirs. A fire is coaxed back to life. Water is drawn. The kitchen, that perpetual heart, begins its rhythmic work again. And the cycle, as it has had done for centuries, as it has done in every castle, from the windswept coasts of Scotland to the sun-warmed plains of Castile, begins once more. This is what it meant to be a servant in a castle. Not romance, not fairy tale, but something more interesting, an actual human life with its labor and its community, its moments of genuine skill and beauty, its hardships, and its small satisfactions. A life embedded in a world as precisely ordered as a mechanical clock, and as fragile. A life that made civilization possible, in the most literal and practical sense of that word. the castle endures, its stones still standing. The servants who inhabited it left no monuments, but they were there in every meal served, every fire lit, every chamber cleaned, every night safely watched. They were there, and they mattered.